We all know of his representation in the, should I say, bully and the bullied case. But his resume and credentials are prodigious, and they defy enumeration. Suffice it to say, for this occasion and in the context of the business of sport, he's an adroit middle stump pace bowler, David, cricket, with piercing baseline ground strokes and volley winners, lawn tennis, a hat-trick goal scorer, football, a man who tees off gently and intelligently with sights on the coveted eagle, golf, and a skilled pugilist who negotiates his way around the ring with admirable integrity and ineffable dexterity. These describe easily the consummate attorney at law. Ladies and gentlemen, David Cornwell.
Move on that side, sir.
Good morning. That poetic introduction is most appreciated and embarrassing because the only poem I know are things like roses are red, things like that. Nothing so eloquent. Sir Hall and Lady Hall, you must be both proud and gratified to see the insightful and committed folks here that recognize that Jamaica belongs in the international community of the business of sport. Carole, Milton, Chris, thank you very much for having me. I must acknowledge Weish squared. Steve Weish asked me to participate in this conference, and little did I know that when we had the chance to get together, we would do so on the heels of a historic development in American sports. Last week, Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers and the National Basketball Association, was exposed for who he is, a bigot, a racist, a fool. There was a time in American history when the sentiments expressed by people like Donald Sterling resulted in lynching, killing, unfair employment, unfair housing, and protests. But the evolution of the business of sport and the importance of sport in American society resulted in a different response this week. I want to talk about Donald Sterling and the response in the historical perspective of American sport. And to do so, I think we need to start with better technology. No, seriously. Need to start with, in 1919, the commissioner of Major League Baseball at the time was Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And 8 players from the Chicago White Sox were believed to have conspired to throw the World Series. And Mountain Landis banned them from baseball. And a lawsuit was filed challenging the commissioner's authority to ban players for baseball in a disciplinary matter. And for the first time, and then the American sports industry was at its threshold, much like you are today. The courts found that the commissioner has absolute authority to protect the public's confidence in the integrity of the game. And over the decades, that's come to be recognized as the commissioner's best interest of the game powers. And every commissioner in American professional sports has the authority to protect the public's confidence in the integrity of the game. And that's the authority upon which Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, acted this week. But there's also a greater and more significant historical underpinning for the reaction to Donald Sterling. In 1936, Jesse Owens participated in the Olympics in Berlin and won 4 gold medals: the 100 meters, 200 meters, the 4x100 meter relay, and the long jump. And he performed in front of perhaps history's greatest bigot, Adolf Hitler. And his supremacy, his excellence, his commitment to excellence, and his performance single-handedly undermined Hitler's perception or myth of Aryan supremacy, a black American in sport. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first black man to play in the modern era of Major League Baseball. But he just didn't play. He became a symbol of America's civil rights movement, a predecessor to men like Martin Luther King because of his dignity. In the middle of America's civil rights movement in 1968, Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith won the gold and bronze medal in the Olympics. And when they climbed to the podium to accept their medals, they did so shoeless. They wore black socks in tribute to the black poverty in America. And each of them wore a black glove. And as is the tradition for the gold medalists, the Star-Spangled Banner, America's national anthem, was played when Tommy Smith climbed the medal podium. And he and Juan Carlos raised their colored black glove-covered fists in the salute to black power. Black men in sports impacting American history. In 1973, as he closed in on Babe Ruth's home run record, Henry Hammering Hank Aaron received death threats, threatened to kill him instead of allowing a black man to break such a revered record from the institution of baseball held by a white man, Babe Ruth. In the end of the 1973 season, Hank Aaron hit home run number 713. The record was 714. He didn't hit another home run in the 73 season. And when people asked him what he thought it was going to be like to go through the entire off-season with the expectation that he would break the record in 1974, his response was, "I hope to live long enough to see the next season." His life was at risk in sports, but because of the historical significance of a black man performing at the highest levels, his life was threatened. His first at-bat of the 1974 season, he tied the record. And then the Atlanta Braves came home and he broke the record for 715. Numerous other black men in American sport are also part of American history. Muhammad Ali comes to mind. Tiger Woods. Not only are these men part of American sports history, they are inextricably entwined in American history. So we have Judge Landis, his connection to Adam Silver. We have Jesse Owens and his connection to today's black athlete. There's also a historical significance to Donald Sterling's delusion about the business of sport when he said, "I feed them, I buy them houses, I buy them cars." Them being his property, the players. His mistake was believing that players today are property, but because of history, they're partners. In the 1960s and early 1970s, we had the growth of American sports unions. And in the 60s and 70s, the unions fought for things like health benefits. And as the popularity of professional sports in America grew, so too did the revenues earned by the owners. Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the National Football League in the early 60s, went to Congress to get an antitrust exemption so that the teams could pool their rights, their performance rights, to sell for television, national television contracts. A quirk of American history is that baseball enjoys an antitrust exemption. During that period, with the growth of revenues and therefore earnings for the owners of the teams in American sports, all of these sports had one version or another of a reserve clause in their draft rules and in the player contracts that players signed. And these reserve clauses operated to give teams extended rights to these players beyond the term of the contracts that they signed to play. Option clauses, reserve clause, all the same. It limited a player's ability to negotiate his salary on the open market with multiple teams bidding for his rights. And as a result, it suppressed salaries in sports. Baseball, football, and basketball all fought these reserve clauses to get what we have come to call free agency. And free agency is a market concept, a business concept in sports. That when two or more teams bid for a player's services, his salary will rise because of the bidding process, the product of a free and open market. An unintended consequence of free agency in professional sports was owners' inability to control themselves, and that they would bid up salaries to a point that one of the fundamental elements of success in professional sports was threatened: competitive balance. Every sports league in America is based on the concept of competitive balance. That the 32 teams in the National Football League following this or next week's draft, going into the 2014 season, have a chance to win the Super Bowl because in the offseason they're able to retool their rosters, bid in the open market for free agents, and be competitive going into the next season. The worst team last year picks first in the draft to preserve competitive balance or promote competitive balance. Well, competitive balance was threatened by free agency because not all teams made the same amount of money. And the richer teams could buy the better players. An unintended consequence of free agency was a threat to the very fabric of professional sports. It is important in professional sports that out of a 17-week season that last year, Steve would know better than I, but I believe nearly 20 out of the 32 teams in the National Football League believed they had a chance to get into the playoffs. That's competitive balance because we want the fans in Miami, Green Bay, Cincinnati, San Diego, all turning on their TVs, believing that their team has a chance to win and believing that their team has a chance to go to the Super Bowl. So this threat to competitive balance as a result of free agency and the owner's inability to control their unrestrained spending brought in a new phenomenon, the salary cap. That through negotiations with the unions, players agreed and owners offered players a specific percentage of revenues for salaries and benefits. And in any business, when we agree as part of our business to share a percentage of our revenues, we are partners. So from Jesse Owens having to shatter the myth of Aryan supremacy, to Jackie Robinson having to prove that a black man belonged in Major League Baseball, to Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith proving that they're excellent. Tommy Smith said, if I win, I'm an American. And if I lose or do something bad, I'm a Negro. So on the backs of these men, these historic accomplishments of these men, that black men in baseball, football, and basketball go from being unwanted. They threatened to kill, take the life of Henry Aaron if he broke Babe Ruth's record. Go from being that much, hated that much, to being partners with a percentage of the revenues. There are other points in our sports history that have impacted American history. In 1987, the summer of 1987, Al Campanis, drunk on Nightline, ABC Nightline, I believe it was, with Ted Koppel, explaining why blacks could now participate in sports, but could, as participants, as athletes, but could not participate in sports as businessmen, as managers, coaches, executives. Al Campanis explained why there was a dearth of blacks in front offices and league offices in America. It was because we lacked, I want to make sure I get it right. We lacked the necessities. We weren't smart enough to Al Campanis. Little known fact is that about 6 weeks before Al Campanis made his comments, Commissioner Pete Rozelle, who was probably the greatest commissioner in the history of professional sports in America, sat down and interviewed a young 26-year-old lawyer, black lawyer, to join the legal staff of the National Football League. In addition to being a lawyer for the commissioner was also searching for someone who he could ask to develop and lead programs that would result in the NFL offering more opportunities to minorities in coaching and executive ranks on teams and in the league office. And shortly after Al Campanis made his comments, Commissioner Rozelle called that lawyer and said, "David, we'd like to hire you." And in September of 1987, I joined the league office as a lawyer, assistant counsel, and with the responsibility of developing programs that would result in increased representation of minorities in all phases of professional football off of the field. We had no black head coaches, no black general managers, no black offensive or defensive coordinators. And out of the some 14 or 18 black assistant coaches, they were primarily coaching running backs and defensive backs. Widely recognized that offensive line coaches, quarterback coaches on the offensive side of the ball got the opportunities to become coordinators, and coordinators got the opportunity to become head coaches. So we developed programs to increase our access to minorities to come into our league. And as Vernon Jordan told me, we had to also practice a bit of social work. In March of 1988, We only had 28 teams in the National Football League at that time. I stood before the owners of the 28 National Football League teams, and it was the first time in the history of the National Football League that a black man addressed the ownership, a black man who had not been previously a player, addressed the ownership in the National Football League, 1988. I recognize that we were talking about the business of sports. And many people viewed the issue of minority representation in sports as a race issue. I viewed it as a business issue. One of the things that I noticed when I got there, all of the league's public comments about minority representation in sports talked about the need to find qualified minorities. That was a knee-jerk reaction to the anti-affirmative action perception that if black people got jobs, it was because the requirements for entry were softened, lessened to let us in. But I knew growing up in a home where my father was a surgeon, my mother was an educator, my older sister was a lawyer, my older brother was a surgeon, my younger brother was a surgeon, my older sister was a graduate of Wharton Business School, that it wasn't that difficult to find qualified minorities. All I had to do was look to my left or my right at dinner. So one of the first things I did was take the qualifier qualified out of our public statements. It's presumed. You don't say qualified white people. We're not going to give jobs to anybody who's not qualified, and we don't have to turn over rocks to find people. So when I stood in front of the ownership, I knew that in order to get people to respond responsibly to an issue, you must present it responsibly. And I didn't think that this was a race issue, it was a business issue, so I looked the owner of the Dallas Cowboys in the eyes, and I said to him, if the person responsible for hiring for the Dallas Cowboys brought you candidates, Mr. Jerry Jones, and all of the candidates' last names were Jones, every time you look to hire somebody, they only brought you people with the last name Jones. I'm sure at the beginning you would be flattered, but at some point you would be dismayed, and ultimately you would question the qualifications of your hiring officers and say, can't we find any Smiths? Are there no Smiths that can do this job? And I said, Mr. Jones, eventually you would do two things. One, you would go out and you would find a qualified Smith. And two, you would come back and you would fire your hiring officer for telling you, no, the only people that are qualified to perform for the positions that we have open are Joneses. So too with blacks and other minorities. As owners, you should question why it is that every time you want to hire a head coach, a general manager, an offensive coordinator, a defensive coordinator, you only get access to Joneses. Why not any Smiths? Why not any black folks? Why not Tony Dungy? Why not Ozzie Smith? Why not Jimmy Ray? Why not Art Shell and Denny Green, who were hired as the first black head coaches in the modern era of football. And so it's against that historical backdrop of the powers of the commissioner, free agency, salary caps, revenue sharing, and the impact of black men on the business of sports, that we must look at the comments of Donald Sterling. First of all, he said, "I buy them homes. I buy them cars. I feed them." Delusional. This man is an owner of a team, or was a team in the National Basketball Association, and he didn't understand the history of the business of sports. Donald Sterling was widely recognized as the joke in the National Basketball Association. I remember going to a Clippers game years ago with Lee Steinberg and sitting with Billy Crystal and Donald Sterling. And my impression of him before I met him was that he was a clown, because he owned a building, a high-rise building in Los Angeles. He also has a real estate company. This high-rise building is vacant, but for 2 floors. One floor houses Sterling's office and executives that work with him in connection with his businesses. And the other floor houses his real estate, a high-rise in Los Angeles. I don't care how rich you are. That's stupid. Unoccupied. His teams consistently at the bottom of the barrel in terms of wins and losses every season, historically at the bottom of the barrel, historically, therefore, because of competitive balance, at the top of the draft, drafting great players, not developing great teams. Those great players couldn't wait to leave. I think it was Ron Harper, and you reminded me of Danny Manning, likening getting to free agency and leaving the Clippers to breaking out of jail. And so during this period, when he had multiple losses and few wins, and was making as much money as the owners of the Knicks and the Lakers, the Chicago and the Houstons and the San Antonios, he thought he was feeding them. When it was Akeem Olajuwon, Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, Shaquille O'Neal, David Robinson, whose excellence and commitment to excellence and performance as black men in professional sports raised the popularity of the National Basketball Association, and therefore the amount of money that they could charge for their national TV rights, the popularity of sponsorship, national sponsorships, the sale of jerseys, and other marketing income, all of which is pooled and shared among the then 28 and now 30 owners in the National Basketball Association. They were feeding him. You couldn't be more wrong. Where Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith were left to ascend the podium, shoeless, in protest, Chris Paul, the president of the NBA union, former players like Mayor Kevin Johnson, Jerry Stackhouse, they didn't need to protest because they were partners. He talked about them like they were property. He couldn't have been more wrong. They were partners. And they made it clear through the dignity of Doc Rivers. If you do not do something, we will not play. So from Jesse Owens to Chris Paul, from protest to partner, black men stood up and said, you cannot think of me as property and then profit off of me as a partner. We will not play. But this had greater significance in my mind in American history because in sports we have seen what I've called the kryptonite issues. First, it was gambling with Judge Kennesaw Landis. Nothing threatens the integrity of the game more than gambling. The Black Sox scandal. And over the last 2 decades, with the proliferation of steroids and other performance-enhancing substances in sports, steroids became a kryptonite issue, threatening the integrity of the game. And while we've had racial controversy in American sports before, this week racism was added to the list of kryptonite issues for which we have zero tolerance. We will not let the owners own the teams and think that they own the players. From property to partners. Just as we have seen the growth of American sports have an impact on American history, I'm pleased to be here because I'm certain with your commitment to excellence that the growth and focus on sports here in Jamaica will have a profound impact on the culture and history of Jamaica. And I thank you for allowing me to participate in that.